Phoenix Lite configuration.
Okay, so now we're ready to have the Phoenix SQLite software activated. We're going to go ahead and show you how to set up your program to work with your fuel management system. So we'll click on the shortcut to open up the program, and we'll click on Settings. And underneath Settings we have the tabs Address, Book, Global, Card Defaults, Fuel Zones, Price Zones, Configuration, and Migration. Your address book entry basically is setting up contact information that you can assign to your individual sites or the actual accounts that are used to manage your cards through the Phoenix application. To add an address book entry, and you simply would click on Add and add in the information pertaining to the person that you want to assign to the address book. Here we have Johnny Appleseed already added in, and once you have him added in, you would just save that information. You can add as many address book entries that you like. There's no limit. Global, this is information that has to match up to what you have set up in your fuel site controllers, which are your Fsc 3000s and your older System 2 controllers. Underneath fuel site controller, you need to make sure if you're using accounts in your systems that you have this radio button selected. If you're not managing accounts in your fuel site controllers, then you would select the fuel site controllers do not use account cards. The auto flag all new and modified cards for update, that's an option that should be set. It makes inputting of the card records into Phoenix a lot more easier. It actually saves you a step from having to click on a checkbox on the card screen every time you add a new card in, so I recommend saving that. As always, any changes that you make, you would just click on the save button and they'll save that information. Underneath your general setup, you have some options that should be set, and it's just a reference whether you're using gallons or using metric for liters. Okay. And if you're using the pin feature in the fuel site controller when you're adding in your single or driver type records, and you want pin numbers to be generated, which would be like the security number, as you're adding the cards into Phoenix, when this box is enabled, you will get a four-digit unique pin associated with the card number that you're setting up within the application. If you're not going to use pins, you simply uncheck that checkbox and then save your change. Bad odometer tracking. Okay, this is totally optional to set up in the program. This is not real-time checking that happens at the fuel island. With any of these boxes that are enabled for single-digit entries, the same digit entered in multiple times, a sequentially entered in value, or an entry does not meet the defined MPG range, any of these that are enabled in the application, as you're polling your sites to get your transaction data, it will check the odometer value stored on the transaction record to see if any of these features or criteria is met on the transaction that's being brought into Phoenix. And if it does, it flags the transaction that it's got a bad odometer with one of these reason codes. Again, this only happens during the polling cycle. It does not happen at the fuel island. User strings. Okay, user strings, you set up your company name. This is the company name that's going to show up on your reports. If you're using the miscellaneous entry title for something in the fuel management system for like an extra prompt, you can set up that title to reference that prompt information. It's just a label change. And then you have also on the card window, you have a couple extra fields set up that can be used to identify, like maybe you need a cell number field. So on the card screen, we can change this field to say cell and save that. And then basically when you're entering your cards into Phoenix, this field will represent cell, and then you can put in the person's cell phone number or emergency contact. You also have similar labels on your account screen. You can have account users 1, 2, 3, and 4. These fields are just used for adding additional information pertaining to the account. So like on the account user screen here, we'll change one of them to say emergency contact, and then we'll just save that. Okay, where these two changes represent, I'm just going to jump a little bit and show you on the account screen itself, on your account information, on the FSC account tab, miscellaneous. We have now this field. This says emergency contact, and here again it's just a label, and you put in who that information or what the information should be. And then on your card screen, we have the user defined 1 was over here. This is the self field that we changed, and here's the user defined 2. Okay, so those are just additional fields that you can put additional information in. Nothing that happens real time at the fuel system level at all. Going back to settings, back to global, and that's this is what we just covered. And then you have titles for the card 1 title, card 1 short name title, card 2 title, card 2 short name. Some people refer to the driver as maybe the employee. It's you can change that title from driver to say employee, and it still would have the value of the card number that represents them or identifies them. Of course, if you change the title for the data input from driver to employee, obviously then you want that to represent the short name field is their employee name, not the driver name. And then you also have the same thing for the card 2 titles. So if you're using vehicle cards with your driver card information, you can change the title from vehicle to say truck number and truck name. If you're using just a single card system, meaning it's just one card that allows them to get fuel, you're not tracking who's putting fuel into what vehicle, then only this title needs to be changed. It'll default to the driver. Okay. Reasonability. What the reasonability feature allows you to do for single site operation only. So this only pertains to one site, not multiple sites. You can use the reasonability feature in your fuel site controller, and then as you're creating your card records in the fuel management system, you assign a code number to your card record, and the code number represents what the range is for the miles traveled in between fueling. So let's say, for instance, the card has a range of 0 to 250 miles. Okay, so if you put a mileage that exceeds the range that's defined for the code, let's say we put in 255 as a new mileage differential between the previous fueling, that transaction could be flagged that it's got a bad odometer, and you could have the system set up not to allow fueling, or after the third bad entry, if they're all out of the range that they're keying in at the terminal, then you can allow them to get fuel, but just flag the transaction that it does have a bad odometer and you allowed it to take place. Some people use this feature, like again, this is just for a single site. If you have multiple sites, this would not work in that situation because the mileage is actually being checked at the site level, not on the card level. Products, this is your default table. You have 32 product codes to match across your fuel site controllers. So any description change in your fuel site controller, whether it's one site or many sites, they all should have the same description at each site level. Code 1 in this case is unleaded. You want to make sure that code 1 in your systems are set to unleaded. Then you have a box that says affects MPG. If the box is unchecked when the transactions are brought into Phoenix, you can when you go to generate reports, there's a calculate MPG function that basically will calculate your distance and your miles per gallon. If the box is unchecked, obviously any transaction that has that code number for the product, if the box is unchecked, it will not calculate the MPG calculation for you. Product restriction. If your fuel system is set up to use product restriction, you have to match the code number to the restriction level set up that is in your fuel site controller. So if you're running both unleaded and diesel at the site and you want to restrict certain users that should only get unleaded and not diesel, you would set up your codes accordingly to match your fuel system. So if you want to set up code 1 to say unleaded only, code 2 to be diesel only, you have to make sure that these code numbers are also matched the same way in each site controller that these cards are going to be sent down to. Quantity restriction. If you're using this feature in the fuel system, you want to make sure again that these values for each code that is set up on the Phoenix side matches to the values that are being enforced at the fuel system level side, and it's a per transaction limit. Message prompts. These are additional prompts on top of what the fuel system already is set up to prompt your proprietary cards. Some people may have additional prompts turned on as part of their card file setup where they want to collect additional information from the fuel management system. When that is set up that way, you want to make sure that these prompt codes that are set up on Phoenix match the text and data input that the fuel system is currently set up for. So by default, this A through O table, actually it's U, matches the default settings in your fuel site controller. So let's say, for instance, if someone decided to change the text message here in the fuel site controller to say, instead of driver's license, maybe a tax ID number, you want to make sure that this K code in the fuel site in your Phoenix database says exactly the same thing. So these, like I said, these are the defaults that default to your site controller. Chip key odometer lower limits, upper limits, daily limits, methods. These all pertain to your site controllers that have the optional chip key mileage reasonability feature. If you're not using chip key mileage reasonability in your systems, there's no setting that needs to be matched up here at all. If you do have that feature, you have the capability of managing what fields need to be modified to the chip keys as they're being read in at the terminals. So this all pertains to your optional system that has the chip key read write option. You can set up the various codes here that will represent the lower range codes to your keys, the upper range codes to your keys, and then how many times per day you want the key to be able to be used. And then the method itself is how you're going to enforce a bad entry that's happening at the fuel island if they put a mileage that's outside of the range. Okay. Card status. This indicates how the card is valid or invalidated. Typically every card in the system when you enter it in is going to be a valid card, but you may have several reasons why you're invalidating the card. So even though the fuel system has it just plainly set to an invalid status, in Phoenix you can give it a more descriptive code why it's invalid. If it's invalid at 3 bad pins, the guy didn't pay his limit on there, or the manager disapproved them, locked out for bad credit, and so forth. So we predefine like the first 6 values for you, but you can change the wording, and whatever code you assign to the card in Phoenix, it'll have this description on why it's invalidated. Okay. And then the last thing that's underneath the global is your card types. And this comes into play for people that are processing cards through one of the bank networks that we support or one of the fleet networks. So we'll collect information from each fueling transaction from the network. There'll be a field that represents what type of card it is, and it looks at that field for the lookup code of what the description of the card is. So this is supported in the later Fuel Site Controller 3000s. If you've got an earlier site controller like a System 2, this is not even being used by the older System 2 controllers at all. So basically these come into play when you're running reports through Phoenix by the various credit cards or fleet network cards. It shows you what type of card it is that the transaction was generated by. Going over to card defaults, this is where you can set up a template for each card type that you want to enter into the system. Okay, so we have a card template set up as single, and the default status is valid. And we predefine like the first 12 digits of the card in the card template. So if you're going to have the same type of card created each time you enter into the application itself, it'll use the default parameters from this template as a base, and then all you have to do is key in the particular items that are unique to that card, like the name and the short name. You could also change the quantity level if you don't want to use the default setting that you have set up there, the restrictions, and so forth. You can do this for all three card types. Fuel zones. What fuel zones allows you to do if you have more than one site is you can pick and choose where your new cards that you're entering into Phoenix, to which site they should go to. In the previous version of Phoenix for Windows that we've had, you could not do that. You're managing a global card file throughout the whole application. With the Phoenix SQL Lite, we've put this feature in where if you've got more than one site and you've got cards that should only go to certain locations, you can now do that with the Fuel Zone ID. So with the Fuel Zone ID 1 we have here, it's set up for letting you enter in cards and sending them down to site number 1 only. If you select a card to go into Fuel Zone ID 2 in this example here, it'll allow the cards that you're going down to only site level 2. So that's what the fuel zone process is used for. Obviously, if you only have one site, you would never use the fuel zones. Taking us over to price zone, we have a feature that allows you to set up one or multiple sites on price changes through the application. Okay, and it works almost as the same principle as your fuel zones. You set up a price zone with what site needs to be in that zone. We have two of them set up here by an example, and as you do a price zone change, which we'll get to later on, you'll select what zone you want the prices to go down to for what products, and it'll attempt to change prices on your sites through the application itself. Configuration. Okay, basically this is the email information for sending out an email when the Phoenix SQL Lite software service is going to shut down. It's a service that runs in the background where you want the email to go to and who it's from. The database, this is the database that was created during the installation process. There's a database name, that's the server that the database is under, and then you could set up where you want to do, what time you want to do the actual database backup. File locations. This is the ComLog file that would be created when you're doing your polling or card updates or card backups. There's a default location on this particular machine. You can actually tell it to create the log file somewhere else by clicking on Browse and pointing it to a different location. Error log for the application. the export file. So if you're using the export feature in Phoenix Lite, you could tell where the file is going to be exported to, and there's your database backup location. And then the change config, this is something that comes into play with the communications between the Phoenix SQL Lite application and your individual controllers. This should not be changed unless you're directed by a tech support personnel. And then we've already activated our license, but if there was some type of an upgrade or something that we could do, adding in more sites, then we have an upgrade button. Okay. And migration would allow us to migrate an existing Phoenix for Windows database. So basically you would have to have the database on the machine, and we could migrate an existing user's database into this program, and that would populate all the information that we were just going through. And we'll show that at the end of this. Okay, now that we've gone through all the settings, we'll go into sites. Underneath sites, you'd have to set up the site information for Phoenix to contact. So we have a site 1. Underneath this information is what you'd key in for setting up your site. We have a contact, and this is pulled over from your address book entry. Once you have your site information set up, you go to communications setup for that site, tell what type of controller it is, and how we're going to connect to that controller. Direct connect means we're going to have a serial port connection on this machine directly to the actual site. You tell what COM port. These parameters default for you. The baud rate may change depending on your switch settings in your controller. And then you supply the passwords. Password 1 is always going to be your remote password. Password 2 and password 3, that's your partial access passwords that are used on your Fsc 3000s. On your System 2 controllers, password 2 would be your show password, password 3 would be your privilege password, and password 1 is still your remote. Okay, so those are the COM parameters that you would set up. And then underneath miscellaneous, this is the site ID short name that's used in the site controllers, the 12-character field. You have an option whether or not you want to update the cards after polling the site, if you're doing a manual poll. And then you also have a checkbox to clear transactions after polling. And then you have a primary fuel provider. If you want, you can set that up to your fuel provider. Okay, save. Alright, and that takes care of the site controller setup. If you have an automatic tank gauge also at the location that you're going to be connecting to with Phoenix to do your tank reconciliation with, you would click up on the ATG configuration setup, tell it what type of gauge it is and what type of connection. Okay, and underneath the miscellaneous field, this box should not be set unless unless the tech support department deems that this needs to be set. By default, this should not be set at all. Okay, so that is the information that you need for a site that has both a site controller you're going to connect to and a automatic tank gauge. Okay, and we have a site number 2 that basically only has a controller it's connecting to, but no tank monitor. Okay. Now, because we have a site set up with a tank monitor, we have to tell it underneath tanks for the site, you have to select what site it is, give it a tank ID number, what type of tank it is, and the product that is coming out of that tank. Okay. And then once you have your tank set up for that location, you would assign what pump coming out of that site, what pump number, and the product that's coming out of what tank. So you have the site ID, pump number, the tank ID number, which you defined from the previous tank screen, and the product that's coming out of that tank. So if we were going to add another tank, that's another pump for drawing fuel, unleaded fuel, we just click on New, select the site, select the pump number, and then select the product and save that. So now this site has two pumps, both drawing product out of tank number 1. So these are both necessary to set up to do the tank reconciliation portion. Okay, underneath site utilities. Okay, the site utilities has a backup and restore function. This will only work with System 2 site controllers or the Fsc 3000 site controller that uses the chip key mounts reasonability option. If you're using a PCI compliant version of Fsc 3000, you use your hardware utility to back up your configuration from it. So that backup and restore function is kind of limited to what controllers that'll work with. Okay, and that backs up the configuration. The import poll file function, what that allows you to do is, let's say you have a site controller that you're not connecting physically with Phoenix. You're actually using the USB thumb drive to transfer the transaction file from the fuel system into Phoenix. This is what allows you to import the transaction file. Basically, when you click on the import, you're going to have to point Phoenix to the K2500.trn file that's on this machine to import it, and that imports the transaction data then into your Phoenix application. Email log file. This function allows you to email the log file. You can select what date range, and basically it'll grab the text file that has the communications within it. Okay. Fuel provider. This is just information. Doesn't even have to be set up, but we did set one up for our demo purposes. We set up one that's called Cool Gas Products. Contact name is Joe. Cool. You would actually probably have his phone number on there. If you needed to order fuel, you can pull him up and then, give him a call and get product delivered and what product he's responsible for. Here again, this will not stop you from fueling. It's just more information for you to look at and set up with your fuel system. Pricing. This is similar to the fuel zone, except this works with prices. Basically, we set up 2 zones previously. If we click on price zone ID 1, I can go ahead and modify the prices for whatever product is at the site. Save that, and I can do, and we notice that there's only one member, meaning there's only one site assigned to it. Okay, and then we could do the same thing with price zone 2. Maybe they're in a different part of the country, so they're going to have a little bit of a higher price for the same product. Okay, then basically once you're connected to the site, you would click on your send button and the price zone that you want to send down, and you'll get this response message that it's going to attempt to basically send that price change down to your site. When it's completed, that status would update that it's completed. And we are not actually connected at all, and that's the reason why we're getting a failed status. Same thing with site number 2. Otherwise, it would show you that it passed. That's how you do your price changes through Phoenix SQL Lite. Terminal window allows you to basically open up communications real time to your site controller. Once you click on that, you would select which site you want to connect to, and that would open up your communications to your fuel system once you click on your connect button. Same window that you're used to with the Phoenix for Windows, or if you're using hardware, no different, other than you have a bigger, larger window to look at. FSC status, when you open this window up, basically anything that you've been doing with the communication wise, like sending card updates, polling, you can click on the status. We obviously haven't done anything with the system as a demo, but you would see like our log files here. Okay, so that takes care of everything underneath the Site tab. We're going to go over to the Account tab, and underneath Accounts you have the capability of grouping like your cards into what's called an account, or you refer to it as a department. In Phoenix it's called an account. If you don't want to use accounts, you don't have to. It's got the same rules as your Phoenix for Windows product had. If you were a user of that, you can have all your cards set up as global, and global would only allow you to do drivers and vehicles. This product will not allow you to set up a global single card. So if you are a single card user, you don't want to use accounts, you still would have to set up one account and then assign all your cards to it. Underneath the account ID, this is the account number that Phoenix would use. You give it a name. Because we're managing system accounts in the site controller, we have this field here, and you have to have a unique 4-digit account number that would be used by your Fuel Site Controller 3000 or System 2, and this will be the short name that goes over to it. You select the account name, use your contact for that, and then on your FSC account button, for the FSC account information, you have these restrictions that could be set up, which are similar to your card restrictions. Okay, so that's the information for your account. Global you cannot change, so there's nothing to change into the global account. Adding cards to the program, basically you have to select which account and what type of card. So if we're going to do a new card, you click on new, select the account, whether it's global or driver for your drivers and vehicles. Or single cards, you can select this guy here, select the card type single, and it brings up your default screen that we defined previously, and you key in the information for your card number, name, short name, and all the other pertinent information pertaining to that particular card. The last thing you would do is click on save. So I'm going to cancel out of that. So this is one of the cards that we kind of set up here. Now, because we're using fuel zones in our example here, you wouldn't select fuel at all sites. Okay, if the card only should go to site number 1, which is underneath zone 1, you select fuel zone 1. If it needs to go to zone 2, then you select zone 2. If you don't want to restrict the card, you want it to go to all sites, then you select fuel at all sites. Okay, and this comes into play when you have more than one site set up. And if you're going to use your daily and monthly allocation in your fuel system, you actually put values in here that are supported by your Fuel Site Controller setup. Okay, so that's the information that you need to put in a new card. Underneath the card utilities, you select which site you have added the new cards into, and then you would select your update cards. That sends any new cards or changes you've made to existing cards in Phoenix down to your site controllers. Resend Cards allows you to populate a Fuel Site Controller that has no cards in it, and they exist on the Phoenix side. For instance, if you're adding a new site in and you need to send all the cards that are currently in Phoenix to that location, you would select the site that you want to resend the cards to, and then it'll contact the site and send all the card information as well as system accounts, if you're using that, down to your site controller. Backup and restore work together. Basically, if you want, you can back up your cards from Phoenix and into Phoenix from your Fuel Site Controller, and that all allows you then to restore that image, if that site controller loses its card file, you can do the restore, which will be the opposite. Or if this is a new install of Phoenix and the site controller has been running for years and they have a card file that you want to bring into the program, you can, after you run your backup, you would select import, and that allows you to import your card file into the Phoenix program. This card import here allows you to build like an Excel file within the application and import up to 250 cards from an Excel spreadsheet. This is something that can be done if you're not going to input your cards manually into the program and you have like a spreadsheet that you want to import. You'd have to actually download this spreadsheet to go through that. And then we have a card reassign process. This allows you to reassign cards from one account to another account, a different account. So that's what this reassign process allows you to do. Scheduler. Scheduler allows you to set up an event for backing up the site. Again, if your site controller supports the backup and restore feature, you can select that as an event. But when you do back up the system, it will take the site down. No fueling would be allowed. You can set it up to back up the card, pull the site, update the cards to a site, print a report, export data, or you can actually set up the send prices. So what we'll do here real quickly is we'll set up an event called, let's say, daily poll. Okay, and it's going to be poll site. We're going to enable it, and we're going to select it for both locations. So we're enabling both sites. We select the frequency. If you want to just execute only one time and one time only, you specify a date range. If you want it to run on a regular interval, select how often you want it to run. So if we want to do this every day, I'll select every 1 days. And when do you want it to first start? We'll do tomorrow. So we'll have this set up to run every day starting on August 24th. Once you have your frequency set, you click on your poll options. You have the capability of whether or not, if you want to disable any card updates from going down after your polling is completed. If you have this unchecked, then it'll look to see if there's any card updates to be gone down to the site. And because you have a tank monitor set up for site number 1, I would recommend setting up the poll the tank gauge when you're done polling with your site controller. And that'll automatically connect to your tank monitor to get the current inventory and any delivery history from the tank monitor. And then you would just click on save. Okay, and now you have an event that is set up to run. And the last result, it shows you it's unknown because it hasn't run yet. The next time it's going to due date is the 24th. Also on this, once you start gathering some information on the scheduler, you can also check the history of the scheduler for either site, whether it was successful or not, and whatever process it's supposed to run. So you got one for site 1 or site 2. Okay. Fsc Transactions. Once you start polling your site, you will have transaction information in here that you can view. You can also make changes, edit the transaction data that's in here. ATG transactions, which show you any inventories and deliveries that you're pulling from the automatic tank gauge. And then we have reports. And the report utilities allows you to calculate your MPGs for only new transactions that are dated, or we can do all the transactions. So any report that's an activity detail report by single or vehicle card 2s, if you want the MPGs to be calculated out, you must run this function first before running any report. You have site reports. These are very similar to the Phoenix for Windows product. If you're familiar with that, these are basically the same reports. They're just grouped differently. Now these are reports that are grouped by the accounts if you're using accounts, cards, and then you have some basic transaction reports as well as product reports. To run any type of report that you have available to you, since we don't have a bunch of data in here, we will just, let's say, we'll run a report by a single card master listing report and select all, generate, and this is the report that you can view. Also, you can print it, or if you wanted to, you can export that report out. These are the formats that are supported. So if we wanted to do like the PDF format, we can give it a file name, and we'll just save this on the desktop, save it. It says exports completed. There's my test PDF, and from here you can print it, or if you need to email it to somebody, you can. Alright, so this is the run through of going through the application without migrating any data. I think my next step would be is going back to settings, and let's do migration. We'll do the migration portion now, so we'll click on migration, click to start migration, and then we're going to click the run selection on this screen. Accept the license and click next, and because we have the database on the locally machine, we're going to select next on this window. I'm going to browse and point to the database, and then click install and import. Okay, you will get a question about the database existing already. Do you want to overwrite it? In this case, it's Phoenix SQL Lite. We're going to answer yes. Okay, once you get the successful message, you can click OK. And if you want to verify your data, you would basically go into your site window, and you can see the sites are different now than what we were actually hand configuring before, so it did overwrite the database because now we have a site 2 and a site 3. There is no 1 and 2. There is no tank information, and there's no pump information, so that database was not managing a tank monitor at the location at all.
To enable the in-app help menu, go ahead and press the F1 key.